Well, we are in the middle of a series about something every one of us experiences really every single day. We plan our schedules around this. We plan holidays around it. And as we talked last week, this topic is hunger. This topic is hunger that we're looking at. The question isn't if we hunger. The question is, what are we hungry for? And beyond that, what are we filling ourselves with? For hunger drives us. It's one of the strongest motivators that God has built into us. And spiritually speaking, hunger points to something much deeper. It's a longing for growth, for meaning, for purpose, and ultimately a hunger for God Himself. Last week, as we really jumped into this series, we looked at two statements that Jesus made in the Sermon on the Mount. One of them was this beatitude: "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." A little later on, Jesus says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Jesus is making it very clear. Seek first and you will be filled. Seek first and you will be satisfied. Seek the blesser, not just the blessings. Today, as we continue this series, we're going to be looking a little bit at Moses. Moses is one of the most well-known people in all of the Bible. Even if you are not a follower of Jesus, Moses is a person that most everyone knows about. And if you've ever read through the Old Testament, you look at the life of Moses, he lived quite the life. We're going to be looking primarily at Exodus 3, but before we get there, it really is important to give a little background on this man. And not just this man, Moses, but the plight of the Israelites in the beginning of the book of Exodus. For the more you look at this, and what we look at today, you begin to find reasons why we should be hungry for God. For nothing else will ever really and truly satisfy. The more you grasp the majesty, the wonder, the holiness of God, the more you begin to realize He is worth hungering for. So when we open the book of Exodus, you find the Israelites, God's chosen people, they are in Egypt. Joseph, at the end of Genesis, had saved the lives of the Egyptian people by providing with this incredible God-given plan during a massive drought. The Israelite people are growing in number. A new Pharaoh takes over who didn't remember Joseph. And you'll notice that fear begins to drive the decisions and choices of Pharaoh. Let me tell you something. Fear always leads somewhere dark. Fear always leads somewhere, to put it theologically, bad. It's not a good motivator. Fear easily clouds our judgment. It clouds our decisions. And the results aren't really pretty. And we see this in Pharaoh. Because something you notice about Pharaoh, and as I was reading this a couple of weeks ago, Pharaoh has a plan for God's people. And it's not good. And here's the truth. And I do not say this to scare anybody, but there is an enemy that does not like you. Pharaoh is the enemy of God's people. He did not like the fact that the Israelite people were growing in number. So notice what Pharaoh does. He enslaved the people. Now all of a sudden they're working for the Egyptians. Then that wasn't enough. He ordered the midwives to kill all the sons of the Israelites at birth. These midwives were incredible. They feared God more than Pharaoh, and they refused to do it. So Pharaoh had to take another step. And what did he do? He ordered all the male sons to be thrown into the Nile. 1, 2, 3. 3 times. Three ways to try and eliminate God's people. And it just struck me when I was reading this a couple of weeks ago. Isn't that just like the enemy? He comes at you one way and you feel successful and you have success. Guess what? He's not stopping. What does Jesus say in John 10? The thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. And I say this again, there is a spiritual battle happening. You're like, well, Chris, I don't want to be a part of that spiritual battle. Well, I got to tell you something, you're in it. And when I say this, I'm not saying there to be fear at all. Because see, he who is in me is greater than he who is in the world. The Spirit of God, as Jacob said today, that is in us is the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead. I don't have to live in fear. What I'm telling you is be very leery of taking it easy. Have you ever done that? You know, the Seattle Seahawks won the Super Bowl. Mike Kinling's family rejoices loudly. And they won the Super Bowl. And what did they have? They had a parade. We have a parade. We have a victory. What do? We have a parade. And then what do we usually do after we have that parade? We go on vacation. We take it easy. And I'm just telling you spiritually, we really don't have time to take it easy. Because every time I check, the enemy does not stop. Pharaoh said, it didn't work here. I'm going to try this. It didn't work there. I'm going to try that. He never stopped. He never stopped. Knowing this should add to my hunger for more of God. Because I realize more and more how desperately I need him. So that's the plan of Pharaoh, the plan of the enemy. And right away, I'm struck in how we should all be just in awe of God, and how he can work out what just seems impossible. Pharaoh demanding all the Israelites to be thrown into the Nile and drowned, and God begins to turn those plans upside down. Think about that. An Israelite mom throws her son into the Nile, protected inside a basket, and that child, Moses, floats right into Pharaoh's very own household. Moses, the deliverer of God's people, the one who God will use to defeat Pharaoh, is brought up right in front of him. Isn't that so God? Isn't that just how God works? The enemy thinks he's going to be victorious. He thinks he's going to win. So what's he do? He inserts Moses right there. I'm telling you, I don't know if he's got a sense of humor or what, but I'm telling you, you read that, and I am in awe of this God that we serve. So Moses is raised in Pharaoh's home, but deep down he knows who his people are. So what does Moses do, if you know the story? He tries to deliver the people, and he does it in his way, in his timing, and his strength. And let me just tell you right now, it doesn't usually work that way. It says in Exodus 2, verse 12, Moses goes out, sees an Israelite being mistreated by an Egyptian, looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching. And let me just tell you this, whatever you are doing, and if you are doing something and you're making sure that no one is watching, it's probably not a good idea. If you're on your phone, on your computer, and you're doing something that you would be ashamed that your spouse or your child, probably not a good idea. Let's just talk real. And Moses is doing something to making sure no one is seeing. Probably not a good idea. And so what does he do? He slays this Egyptian, he kills him, and he hides the body in the sand. And as I saw that, just the parallel with David, when he sins with Bathsheba, he wants Uriah killed so he can hide up the sin. Moses is doing the same thing, hiding the body in the sand. Sand's not too solid. It'd be pretty easy to find that. Hiding, let me just tell you something, leads to fear. And I've already talked about fear. When you're hiding something, making sure no one knows, what are you? You're afraid they're going to find out. Fear. So it begins to dictate the next step you take, and pretty soon you're lying. Fear. Ugly, isn't it? Ugly, isn't it? This is what we find in Exodus 2. This is Moses, the man who's going to deliver God's people. You see in verse 25, when you look at Stephen, when he's preaching to the Sanhedrin in Acts 7, he says this about this situation. Moses came to the man's defense. Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize and recognize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they didn't. Moses made a very dangerous assumption. He assumed this murder of the Egyptian would be his coming out party. Instead, it was his covering up party, and he hid the body and found himself on the run. Some theologians like to make the point of bringing out something specific about the murder of this Egyptian, that Moses did this with his own hands, symbolic of his own strength, doing it without God. How often do we get ahead of God? We're tired of waiting, so we jump ahead. And we start to do something in our own way, in our own strength. And I'm telling you, when we do that, we start to have to cover stuff up. It's what happens when we try to do life on our own, in our own strength. Mistakes pile up, fear grows, and everything begins to unravel. All of Moses' plans begin to unravel. Let me just tell you something. It's hard to deliver people when you are on the run. And Moses flees. Flees to Midian, where he finds a woman, marries, has a couple of children, and he begins to tend the flock of his father-in-law. Right there. That's where we find Exodus 2. But let me just tell you something. This is where the story of Moses really begins to take a powerful turn. He's on the backside of the desert, safely out of the reach of Pharaoh. But good news, he's never out of the reach of God. You're never out of the reach of God. You are never out of God's reach. I don't know what you've done. I don't know what your past looks like. You may have disqualified yourself, but I've just read you the man Moses, the deliverer of God's people, one of the most well-known and revered figures in all of Bible history, murdered a man. Hello? You're not out of God's reach. Don't disqualify yourself. Amen? Because I know some of you here have done that. It's not too late. God can use your junk and make it turn beautiful. Again, I say, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's very own home. He wanted Moses dead. That's who he was going after. Moses is raised. I'm telling you, God will use you. So Exodus 2 ends with this passage, and I feel it's important to mention this. The Israelites are in a bad place. Moses is in a bad place. And it ends with what we would call a lament. And in the midst of this lament, we will begin to see the hand of God. And we begin to realize more and more why we should hunger for Him. It says in Exodus 2, verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. He remembered His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. The people are groaning, a cry that rises from deep within. It's a sound of prolonged suffering, and maybe that's where you are today. It's the weight of pain that has gone on far too long. Whether it's physical, emotional, or spiritual, it's the cry of a heart that is overwhelmed by circumstances bigger than themselves. Circumstances that might not even be of your doing, but they're there nonetheless. Maybe that's you today. That's exactly where the people of God are at this moment. Overwhelmed by circumstances bigger than they are, bigger than them. All you can do is cry out. And let me tell you something. That's okay. Because notice what God says here. It says God heard. God heard their groans. God heard their prayers. God hears your prayers. It says God remembered. This doesn't mean that God forgot. He's like, wow, the Israelites have been in bondage for a long time. Now, when we read that God remembers, it's not like us. Again, we're humans, and we forget a lot. God doesn't forget. When it says God remembers, it means He's about to act. That's what God remembered means. God is about to act. For God to remember means that God is about to move forward. He didn't forget. It says God heard, God remembered, God saw. He saw their plight. He sees yours. And what I love almost the most about all of these is that God knew. God knew. I've mentioned this before, but I believe it bears repeating. When you're going through a difficult situation, when you're going through a difficult time, it is so helpful to know that others know. They might not be able to solve your problem for you, but they know. And if anything, understand they can pray for you. This is why I just know and believe it is important to be a part of a church family. Because you can tell people, and we know we're with you on the journey. To be a part of a small group, to have Christian friends that they can see what you're going through. And you're not doing life alone. God Himself knew what was going on. He knows what's going on in your situation, in your life. Which brings us back to Moses, the deliverer of God's people. We find him on the back side of the desert. The one raised in Pharaoh's household is now living in obscurity. It says this in chapter 3, verse 1. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that, he turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. God said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Wow. Moses, the backside of the desert, far from Egypt, far from influence, far from opportunity, alone in the wilderness, no spotlight, no platform. Away from everyone, away from everything, no cell phone, no coverage if he had it, nothing at all. He's alone and he's vulnerable. This leader, this deliverer of God's people, driven there by his choices, driven there by fear, driven there because of his actions, he's in what the Celtic people call a thin place, where distractions fade and we become aware of how vulnerable and how dependent we are. You know, it's interesting in our life. I mentioned this hymn last week, the things of earth grow strangely dim. But often our struggle is the opposite. The things of God grow dim because all we can see is the struggle right in front of us. I want to get to where everything else becomes strangely dim because of God. I want to be in that thin place like Moses was, where the distractions are gone. Amen. And it's there that something happens. Notice what he does. Point 1, I should just have 2 points, but I have a lot for each one. You're like, great. That's always great, right? You're like, I'm hungry. We're talking about hunger, so I'm sure you've thought about hunger. I'm starving. Anyway, God shows up in a bush. Verse 3, Moses says, I'll turn aside. Moses turned aside. When you are hungry for God, you will turn aside. When you are hungry for God, you will turn aside. It wasn't that the bush was burning that was a big deal to Moses. It was the fact that it wasn't consumed. It was the fact that it wasn't burning up. This bush piqued his attention. So he turned aside. You may be here today saying, well, if I saw a bush burning without being consumed, sure, I'd turn aside. Would we? Because, see, I know we all have something that I've already mentioned that Moses did not have. We have this. Man, what are we willing to turn aside for? We can worship at the drop of a hat. We have it everywhere. We can go and I'm telling you, what are we willing to turn aside for? We can. Question again comes back to our hunger. Are we hungry enough for God to turn aside? Because I'm going to tell you something. You're like, well, golly, God really went after Moses. God went after you. Yeah. We just celebrated Christmas. You realize what that day's about. Not about presents. It's about God sending his son as a baby. In about 40 days, we are celebrating Easter, which is another example that Jesus, this sinless one, lived a perfect life and died because of my sin. And then he rose again. Yeah, he's come after me. For me to say, oh, he came after all of us. Don't ever lose sight of that fact. And we have this. He's wooing you every day, every morning. Yeah, he's coming after you. It may not look like a burning bush, but it's there. Question is, are we hungry enough to turn aside? I'm going to tell you something. Moses' life was completely changed because he was willing to turn aside. Because he did that. Now, look at verse 4. I know I've mentioned this before, but it's been a few years, and you've probably heard it. But it always strikes me that the Lord didn't speak to Moses until Moses turned aside. Until he made that effort to go look at this bush, God hadn't spoken yet. God didn't speak till Moses turned aside and went after God. Well, there's something there, isn't there? What would have happened if Moses wouldn't have turned aside? What if Moses would have kept walking like we do so often? God's calling me to go spend time in prayer, but I got to go do this. How often do we miss hearing from God because we're too busy moving forward and toward our own plans. Too often what we do in life is we hunger for our destination instead of hungering for God himself. Perhaps, just perhaps, one of the main reasons we find ourselves not hungering or hearing from God is we don't turn that way. Can I tell you something I love about this? Not only did God speak when Moses turned aside, but it says God saw. God saw that Moses turned aside. He sees when you turn aside. He sees when you take time to worship. He sees when you take time to serve others. He sees when you turn aside. He sees when you deviate from your quote-unquote plans and spend time with him. God, I'm hungry for more of you. God notices this. I don't know about you, but that's pretty neat that God will notice when we do that. So then you see Moses, he goes towards God in verse 5. God says, take off your shoes. We need to acknowledge the very presence of God. Take off your shoes. You know, in the Old Testament, you'll notice covenants were at times sealed with some kind of footwear deal. Seems odd to us if I were to throw a shoe at Jacob and say, okay, now we've got a deal, right? That just seems different. But that's what they did back then. You think about the story of Ruth. What did Boaz do? What did they? He gave him a what? Gave him a sandal. And it just sealed the deal. Take off your shoes. Acknowledge God. We need to have that hunger to allow ourselves to be vulnerable before him. In other words, we need to make sure we understand that we're coming to God on his terms, not ours. When I see that God told Moses to take off his shoes, it's kind of a reminder of the grand order of things. He is God, and I am not. Some of people see that taking off the shoes as getting rid of the profane, as getting rid of the junk, like the priests would do when they entered the sanctuary. And then you also look at the symbolism of taking off your shoes. It's literally a forfeiting of our comforts. It's a forfeiting of our rights. It shows a willingness to surrender all before God. And that's what Moses is doing. He's surrendering everything, his past, his present, and his future to this God who will equip him to do everything. Are we willing to turn aside? Are we willing to be humble and humble ourselves before God? Elizabeth Barrett Browning has an interesting little quote. She said, earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries. We're too busy doing what we want to do. You see, God is present in more places than we often realize, but only those who are paying attention respond. Are we willing to turn aside? Are we willing to humble ourselves before him? God announces who he is to Moses, and Moses responds how most of us would. He hides his face. Then God goes on to tell Moses, look, Moses, I've seen, I've heard, and I'm aware, and I've come to rescue. Verse 10, he says, go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. And we know the story. Moses puts up a fight on why he cannot. And verse 12 gives us yet another reason why we should hunger for God. No matter what he's telling you, through the good times and definitely through the bad. This just struck me this whole week. God literally looked at Moses and said, Moses, I will be with you. That's it. He goes on and says, look, I am the I am. The I am is with you. We really do forget this. We may sing it on Sunday, we may believe it on Sunday, but for some reason when Wednesday hits and this happens or that happens, and it's crushing, we forget that God says, but Moses, I am with you. Put your name in there. When we go to God and give him all these reasons and all this, why I don't want to do that, I can't do that, this is impossible, blah, 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 blah. God is saying, but I am with you. But I am with you. The I am is with you. I'm telling you, do not lose sight of that. That alone makes me long for more of God, knowing he is with me every single time, every single day. Turn aside for the I am. The question is, what are you truly hungry for? Are you really hungry for more of him? It's interesting, Jesus asked a question of James and John, the brothers. They were following John the Baptist, but John the Baptist says, look, there's Jesus. So they leave John the Baptist, and they began following Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but you would think that Jesus would commend them, that he would pat James and John on the back and say, well done. But what does Jesus say? Jesus turns to James and John and asks them a very simple question. He says, what do you want? What do you want? It's a question I have for all of us. What do you want? What are you really hungry for? If you recall the story of blind Bartimaeus, he was blind, that's why he's called blind Bartimaeus. He was brought to Jesus, and Jesus asked him a very similar question. What is it that you want me to do for you? There are so many different things, aims, and goals that we want in life. The hunger for them is what drives us. It's what propels us. We need to allow that hunger to push us more and more towards Jesus. What is it that you want? Do you want to be satisfied? Do you want to be filled? The only way that's going to happen is if you follow in the footsteps of Jesus, if you turn aside, if you acknowledge his presence. You see, I find it interesting when I read through the Gospels and I see what people were willing to do to get to Jesus. They would push through crowds. They would tear a hole in a roof. They would scream in the name of Jesus. They would climb a tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus. What are we willing to do? Are we willing to turn aside? Question is, do you want to be satisfied? You know, with computers, smartphones, smartwatches everywhere, we are on them so often, and it's begun to rewire our brains for distraction. That distractions, these affect us in our daily lives, in our relationships, and all that we do at work, at home. The list could go on. This proclivity for distraction, unfortunately, begins to bleed into our spiritual lives. And we can find ourselves too distracted to pay attention to God. We can find ourselves too distracted to notice a burning bush. We can find ourselves too distracted to turn aside. And our hunger remains. There's a song by Josiah Queen that has a lyric that jumped out to me this week. You've likely heard it. We got dust on our Bibles, brand new iPhones, no wonder why we feel this way. Because see, if he's that important, if you want that hunger satisfied, I'm telling you, you're going to go after him. See, I love the story of Moses just in these first few chapters, as Moses knew there was more, and maybe deep down you know it too. Perhaps you feel like too much time has passed, too many mistakes have piled up, too much stands in the way for you to do anything. Somehow along the way, maybe you're here today and you've chased everything this world has to offer, and you've unfortunately lost that childlike wonder of God. God still calls. God still hears. God still sees. God still knows. And better yet, God still remembers. It's never too late to turn aside. It's never too late to acknowledge his presence, to turn toward him and discover that there is still more with God than anything you've ever seen, anything that could ever happen. And I truly mean that, and I truly believe that. Turn aside. Acknowledge his presence. You'll never be the same.